Welcome back to C# for Total Noobs on Developer Ramp-Up. In this lesson we'll talk about conditional statements. And this is a really important topic because starting with this point we will add logic to the application that we have developed so far. And conditional statements are the first piece of logic that we would use in any program that we write. Then loops come afterwards, and of course we will talk about loops in the next lesson. But let's get started with conditional statements and launch Visual Studio. Here from our recent list we will choose our My First App solution that should open or bring up the project that we have been working on since the beginning of this training course. It takes a few seconds, but then we should be good to go. And as you can see, this is exactly the status where we left the application after we discussed operators. So let's do a little bit of cleanup here and delete everything because we won't need this part anymore. Let's also delete this variable here because we don't have it anymore, and we are now clean and good to go. Coming now back to this topic of the lesson, which is conditional statements. Normally in C#, there are, in my opinion, two conditional statements that we use. One is the if statement and the other one is the switch statement. And in this lesson we will look at both of them. We would look at the syntax and how they are supposed to work and how can you implement them. So let's start, of course, with the if statement. Let's make a comment and make here if statement. Now the if statement has a very simple syntax and it is the following. So if, then parentheses, and in parentheses you have to specify a certain condition. Let's see, x is greater than y, and after the condition we need a set of curly braces. So what does this mean? It means that the logic that we need in this if statement will put in a code block, a total separate code block that is delimited by this set of curly braces. And here of course we can add our application logic. So what should our program perform if this condition is met? And let's also give an example of it. We would need a variable int x equals 7. And let's also add another variable int y equal 5 or 6. Let's make it 5. Good. So right now we have two variables and we have here an if statement that evaluates the relation between these variables. So this means that if x is greater than y, then perform a certain type of logic. And in this case we could simply write a message to the console that explains or informs the user if x is greater than y. But what we want to do is simply, or we could do this by adding a string here, and let's see it here, 7 is greater than 5, and that should be okay. So we display this message if this condition is met. So if we run now the application, I would expect to see on the console 7 is greater than 5. And in fact, that is the case. So our if statement was triggered. Now the idea is that what happens, or the way our programs are compiled and work, basically if this condition is met, then this statement is executed. But if this condition is not met, the execution of the program goes simply to the next line of code, which should be this console write line. Of course, this console write line doesn't do anything at this point, so we can also delete it. And in this case, if this condition is not met, then it would jump to console read line. So it won't perform anything. Let's, for instance, try to do this. Let's make it here 3. And if we run now the program, I would expect to not see anything in the console at all. We see that the console doesn't display anything, but it remains open. So this means that the execution of the program, since this condition was not met, it jumped here to console read line. And here there is another cool thing in Visual Studio that we can do, and this is debugging. And we can check exactly how this works. If you go here on the left, you see this bar, and if you click just besides a code line, or a line number, you would see this red dot, which is a breakpoint. So what this means is that when we debug the program, the execution will stop when we hit the breakpoint. So let's run it again. And as you can see, we hit this breakpoint right now. And we can see here a lot of information. We can, for instance, see here the value of x, we can see here the value of y, and so on. And we can here follow exactly how the execution of this program works. And if we hover the mouse over this is greater sign, we can see the evaluation that we make and the result, which is false. And right now, if we simply here click on step into, we would see that basically, since this was false, the execution jumped at console read line. So in this case, if we go one more time, then the console would appear and it would stay open because our program ended. So there is no further, or there are no further things to execute in this program. However, there are some things that we want to do better in this program. Like for instance, here we have 7 is greater than y. But the value of the variables x and y could change. So we are not every time sure that x would be 3 and y would be 5. So in this case, we would need a way in our string to display the current value of the variable itself. And this is not very complicated, and in fact that there are two ways in which we could do that. The first way that we would use in this if statement is string interpolation. And what string interpolation means, or how we can do that, because that's more important right now, how we can do string interpolation. Before the quotation marks where you put the value of the string that you have, or that you want to have, you just have to put a $sign. And if you put a $sign, you can do then here something like this. Add the curly brace set and put x here. And then instead of 5, let's put a set of curly braces and add y. And how does this work? It's very simple. When we put this dollar before a string, this instructs the compiler and says every time that you see something in curly braces, then this is a variable, so take the value of that variable. And then the compiler knows exactly, okay, this should be right now interpreted as a variable. So what is the value of x? It's 3. And then the compiler will display 3 here instead. Then it will go next, it will display is greater, because this is very clear, it's just a string. And then it would hit the other set of curly braces. And it will say, okay, this means that I would have to interpret what we have inside the curly braces as a variable. So what's the value of y? Or is there a y? Yes, it is, and the value is 5. So I would display 5. Let's make once again x greater than 5. Let's make it once again 7. And we can rerun the program right now. What we should see here is exactly, this result, so 7 is greater than 5, exactly what we had the first time we ran this if statement. The only difference is that now each time we change the value of these variables, we do not need to have anything in this, or we do not have to change anything in the string, because every time we run the program, it will look at the current value of x and the current value of y. So if we run it again right now, we should see here then 8 is greater than 2, which is the case, so this is correct. Now regarding the if statement, this syntax is the very basic syntax of an if statement. So you can have a standalone if statement without anything afterwards. And in that case, as we have seen when we debug this program and when we use a breakpoint, is that if this condition was not met, then the code inside this code block was not executed, and the execution of the program jumped to console read line, so to the next line of code after this if statement. However, let's put also a breakpoint once again to see exactly how this performs right now when this condition is met. Once again, we've hit our breakpoint. We see here that x is greater than y evaluates to true. So in this case, I would expect that we enter this code block, and in fact that is the case. So right now we would have to execute this line which would print the message to the console, and that's it, we have done that. And now, of course, the program will continue to execute all other line of codes in order that come after this if statement. And then we will get our message displayed here because there is nothing else to execute in this program right now. Good. Coming back once again to the if statement. So this is the very simple form. And we simply instruct if this condition is met, then do this here. If this condition is not met, I really don't care, just execute the next line of code. But there are some scenarios, or these scenarios are very often, where, well, we actually care if this condition is not met. And in that case, we have to catch this scenario where the condition is not met. And to do this, we have the else part of an if statement. So what we would do here is, if this condition is not met, then do this line, then perform the code in this code block, else, so in any other scenario, it doesn't care which scenario exactly, but in any other scenario, when x is not greater than y, then execute this code block here. And in this code block, we can simply do a console write line. Here in this console write line, we could also display a message that says that x is not greater than y. And let's do that. And here we would use the second method to display variables in a string. And in this case, we would do curly braces, but we will put 0 here, and then the message is not greater than, and once again curly braces, and we put here 1. The very important thing here, after this string, we put a colon, or a comma, sorry, and then we have x and y. How does this work? Well, this works in a way similarly to the string interpolation method, but in this case we instruct the compiler and say, hey, when you see something in curly braces, then that is a placeholder for a variable that I would specify a little bit later here. And then it goes further and it sees once again curly braces, and then the compiler knows, okay, this should be a placeholder for another variable that I would specify a little bit later. And why do we use 0 here and 1? Well, it's very easy. Because as we said also when we briefly talked about arrays are 0 indexed, and in fact almost everything is indexed with 0. So this means that we want here to define a certain order of the variables that needs to be displayed. And in this case, the variables that we want to display are defined after this comma. So when we see 0, this instructs the compiler and says, hey, please take the first variable that I have specified after the comma. And the first variable is x, which is 8 in this case. Then it goes further and it sees this placeholder. And this once instructs the compiler that this placeholder is for the second variable that we define after the comma. So this would be y. And in this case, it should be 2. So what we have to do right now is to generate a condition where we hit the else statement. So we have here the condition is x is greater than y. Let's make then x not to be greater than y, and let's make y equal to 10. Now when we run the program, this line of code should be executed, and we'll afterwards look exactly with the debugger how this statement performs. But yes, indeed we got the right answer, 8 is not greater than 10. Good, let's put a breakpoint here and run the program again. And when we run it, we see that we have hit this breakpoint. If we hover our mouse cursor over this is greater sign, we see then it evaluates to false. Now, if we go and execute, we see that the if, or what we have in this code block, is not executed at all. Instead, we hit the else. So the condition, or what we defined, it needs to happen if this condition is not met. And in fact, you see that we go into this else code block and we display this message to the console. When we are ready with the else code block, we simply go with the execution of the program on the next line, which is the console read line. And when we execute it, this should display our message to the console. So I think that this is pretty straightforward. It's also very simple because it's very similar to the way that we speak in current language. So if a certain condition, then do something else, so in any other case, then do something else. However, one thing that we have to know here is then, okay, we have this condition where x is greater than y. And that could be true or false. And until now we have tested only scenarios where x was either greater than y or it was less than y. But what would happen if we put x equal y? So we know that x is 10 and y is 10. So right now also let's put the debugger here, in fact, and run this program again to see exactly what happens. So we hit our breakpoint. Once again we evaluate our condition and we see that it is false. So when we execute this code, we see that it will jump over the if code block and it will go to the else code block instead. So when we execute this, we see that it would execute this else code block, which is expected because we instructed to do so in any other case. So if x is greater than y, do something, and in any other scenario, do this here. So we would display the exact same message. And though the message is not necessarily wrong because 10 is not greater than 10, so logically this should be correct, but we would like also to let's say to do something if these two integers are equal. And here we go one step further with our if statement, because in the if statement we can add another part, and this part would be an else if. So we would do else if and then another code block. Sorry, we would do an else if and we would specify here another condition. If x equal y. And remember last time when we talked about operators, when we check for equality, we have to use this double equal character, because otherwise it would try to do an assignment and that assignment could not evaluate to a bool expression. So this means that we could not use it in this else if statement. And in this case we want to use console write line okay. And here let's also use maybe string interpolation. I like it a little bit more, and make here x is equal to y. Now how does this work? Let's keep this breakpoint here and execute our program. And we hit our breakpoint and we see here, okay, so the execution hits this if statement and evaluates the condition. And is x greater than y? It is not, so it would be false. So when the execution goes on, it would simply jump over this if code block. But then it would hit that else if statement where we have another condition, and this condition is x equal y. And in this case, this condition evaluates to true. So when we, in this case, run the program further, the else if code block will be executed. And in fact, this will get printed to the console. And then the else won't be executed anymore because we had an else if that executed previously. And right now, this should display to our console the message that 10 is equal to 10, which is correct. So the most complicated syntax of an if statement is then if a certain condition, then do something, else if another condition, then do something else, and then else, so in any other case, so if this is not met and this is not met, this is like a catch-all, we do this thing here. Of course, what we could do is also, we could have only an if and an else if. And let's just comment out this else, and there is a button here that you can click when you select several line of codes, and it will comment all the line of codes that you have selected. So you see that this syntax is still valid. We do not have any errors. So you can use only if and then something in that code block. You could use, if it is necessary in your program, if something then do this, else if something else, do something else, and then do nothing else or nothing anymore. But then of course we could also leave this else out, or we could, if you want to catch all the other possible scenarios, then we can comment out this and we can use the else. So using the if statement could be just as simple as using this only an if, and then if this condition is true, then this code block would be executed, and if not, it would simply go to execute the next line of code after the if statement. We could add several other conditions using else if, and then we would, when these conditions are met, we would execute this code block, and else in any other scenario, then we would execute this code block. And when we evaluate two numbers for equality, I think that these are basically all the three scenarios that we could cover. So either is x greater than y, either is x equal y, and in any other case, it would mean that x is less than y. So we can display this, this message which says x is not greater than y, which should be correct. So this is how the if statement works and how we use it in a running program. Let's delete this because we won't need this right now. And let's switch on another case or on another conditional statement that I would like to include in this lesson, and this is the switch statement. And in the switch statement, well, here the main difference between if and switch is that we generally use switch when we have several different conditions that could be true, or well, not at the same time be true, but well, in one case it could be either one option, in the second case it could be another option, and so on. And let's also use an integer x, and let's define it as 3. And the syntax of the switch statement is very simple. Switch parentheses, then we specify the variable that we want to evaluate, and then we use a code block. And here in this code block we put several cases. So let's make a case. Case 1. In this case, console write line. And here in this console we could simply display, let's use string interpolation once again. Okay, x is, let's display the number but with character, so 1. And what we would need here is then a break. We need this to break. Then we could have another case, case 2. And in this case we would console write line. Here we could use once again string interpolation, which is like that, sorry. And here x is 2. Of course we need then the break. After each case we need a break. Then we have finally case 3. And what we want to do here is display console write line. We would use once again string interpolation, and here x is 3. We would add another block here, break first. And here the very nice thing in this switch statement is that we could use a default. And here we could simply display a message in the console that says unknown number. And of course, also after the default, we would need a break. This basically instructs when something is executed to break out of this entire switch code block. And then the program will continue execution by executing the next line of code coming after this switch statement. So in this case, let's first see exactly how this works. We have 3, so we should see on the console 3 is 3, which is correct, I would guess. But let's also try to see exactly how this switch statement works. And if we debug the program right now, what we can see here, okay, we enter the switch statement and X, if we hover the mouse over it, is 3. So when we go now line by line, so we press this step into our F10, okay, we didn't go line by line here, but we see that this X is 3, so we hit directly this case where the variable is 3, and then we display this exact message. So this would display to the console that 3 is 3. If we in fact right now would change this X to be, let's make it 5, in that case we would need to hit this default. So we should get printed to the console unknown number. Let's do that and see if this is really the case. Yes, indeed, unknown number. So once again, this is how the switch statement works. You have to specify the variable or a certain expression that you would have to evaluate. In this case, it is an integer and it is an X. And then we have different cases. So in case X is 1, then execute this and break out of this switch statement. In the case that X is 2, then execute this line of code and then break out of the switch statement. If X is 3, so in case X equals 3, then execute this line of code here and break out of the if statement. And then the last case, so if none of these cases are true, so X is neither 1, neither 2, neither 3, then we would execute the default code block or the default code, which is console write line unknown number, and then we would break out of this switch statement. And this is basically how this switch statement works. Let's now delete this and go to a last thing that I would like to do in this lesson. And in this case, we said that we want to add some logic to our application. And let's make like interactive applications where we ask a certain user to type in a number that would act as a constant. Then we would ask the user for a second number that would be a certain variable. And then we would print out a message to the console and tell them if the second number, so the variable, is greater than, less than, or equal to the constant that they have provided. So let's do that. First of all, we have to display a message to the console. Let's make it console write line, and here please enter a number to act as a constant. Okay, and right now the user should enter a number. The idea is, or the question remains, how can we take the number that the user inputs in the console and assign it to a variable? Now this is not very complicated, because what this console readline method actually does is it instructs the console to stay open and to read user input. Now, of course, until now we didn't give any user input, so we just use this to keep the console open after the code is executed. But we can also use this in order to take or to interact with the user via the console. So we can take inputs from the console via this console write line. So what we would need to do is declare a variable x that is of type integer, of course, and equals, and here instead of providing a certain value, what we could do is simply write console.readline. However, we have a problem. So red alert here, we have a red squiggly line. So if we hover our mouse on it, we get some insights about what's happening. And we see here some information about the read line. It should read the next line of characters from the standard input stream. It says something about exceptions that we don't have to bother about right now. But right at the bottom there is also another information which is very important for this case, and it says cannot implicitly convert type string to type integer. So the problem here is that when we use the console as an input and output device, this means that we basically use strings. We output strings, and when the user types something, it is also interpreted as a string. However, we have defined and declared this variable x of type integer. So this assignment would try to assign a value from the console that is of type string to a variable that is of type integer. And this is not possible in C#. So we have to make sure when we declare a variable, the value of the variable should be the same data type as the variable itself. So what could we do in this case? Well, integers in C# are very interesting because they have also the option to parse string or to parse a string as an integer. So what we would have to write here is simply int.parse. So dot is this member access operator. So with dot we access some things that are inside an integer, and one of those things is this parse. And we'll see exactly in other lessons what this parse is, because it's a method. And here we could simply provide or write our console.readline. What this basically does is the following. It takes the user input from the console, which is of type string, but then it transforms it in type integer if, of course, this is possible. And then it assigns the value to x. So this is how we can read a value from the console, and because in this case we needed a value of type integer, we needed to take the input from the console and parse it to an integer. And right now we have x, which is an integer, and we have something to work with. The next step, of course, would be to ask the user to input the second variable. That would be the one to which we will compare. So console WriteLine, and here let's give as a message, please enter the second number. And in fact, not to use terms like constants and so on, please enter the first number and please enter the second number. And what we would need here, of course, is another variable. It's once again of type integer. Let's call it y in this case, and int parse. We know from the previous time that we need to parse this to integer, and here console.readline, and that's it. So right now we have these two variables that have a value that a user specifies from the console. But now we can already start to work with our if statements, and it's similarly to what we have done before. So if, and here I want to teach you another cool thing about Visual Studio. If you type if and double press tab, so tab, it will implement the basic syntax of the if statement. So you don't have to write all the parentheses yourself. You just had to change here the condition, and this condition would be, let's say, if x greater than y. Good, so now we have this condition here, and we have the code block. What we can do here is then, of course, write console.WriteLine, and we will use, as usual, string interpolation, and that would be this way. And we'll say, so in this case we evaluate the condition if x is greater than y. So if this condition is met, we write x is greater than, sorry for the typo, and here we put this y. So that is okay. Now we know from the exercises that we did previously, we would also need an else if and here another condition. In this case, the condition would be if x equals y, and we would need another code block, and in this code block we will write console.writeLine. As usual, we'll use string interpolation, but not here, in parentheses. Okay, then the quotation marks for the string, and x is equal to, and we put the y variable here. So that's it. And else, because right now we know exactly that in this case x can be either greater than y, it could be equal to y, or the last case it could be less than y. So there isn't another option. So we can safely use here another else block, and to define what happens in all other scenarios. However, before we go with the else block, is just one thing that I want to underline. You could concatenate several else ifs one after the other. So you are not bound to use only one else if. You could use else if this condition then something, else if some other conditions then something else, else if another condition then really once again something new. So you're not bound to use only one else if. You could use several else ifs if needed. And of course, in this case, when we just compare two numbers to see if they are less than or greater than or equal to another number, we just have these three options. But if you want to compare objects, and we will see later in this course when we write to compare own objects of our own classes, well, in those cases we might have more than three conditions or more than three options that we can evaluate against. Let's come, however, back and use this else. Here we need this code block, and in any other case, so if x is not greater than y and if x is not equal to y, then this means that x is less than y. So we can simply go here and use once again string interpolation, and x is less than here the y variable, and that's it. So right now we have done our logic. The next thing is, okay, we should try to run the program, because in our logic we already display a message to the console. So let's check out how our program works. And we run it. It should then start by telling us, please enter the first number. Okay, let's give a number 3. Please enter the second number. Let's give 2. And the result is 3 is greater than 2, which is great. So this means that our application is working correctly. Let's now try another case. In this case, let's give x, so the first number, the second number, and is less than, which is okay. And right now let's try once again our program, and let's give 1 and 1, and we see 1 is equal to 1. So our program works correctly. In this lesson we learned about conditional statements, and we concentrated on the if statement and on the switch, and we looked at the syntax of both these statements. The if statement could get a little bit more complicated. It could have a very simple syntax with if condition then execute something, but you could then define also an else, or you can define several else ifs and then an else, and so on. And switch in turn you would use when you know from the beginning that there is a limited type of scenarios that could be covered, and in that case, as we did with our variable, in case it was 1 then we performed something, in case it was 2 we performed something else, and in case it was 3 we performed something else once again. In the next lesson we won't dive into loops, because I think it would be useful first to do some exercises. So in the next lesson we will take some exercises, we will display some requirements, and then we will build our applications that will met those requirements. So this is basically how it happens in real life. As a software developer, you usually get to know the requirements from the customer, and based on those requirements you have to write a piece of software that meets all that requirements. And we'll do exactly that in the next lesson. Of course, it won't be something very complicated. It will be mostly playing around with if statements and switches. But the idea is that we will have a requirement and we will have to build together a really small piece of software that would fulfill those requirements. So thank you very much for watching this lesson, and I really hope to see you along in the next one.